Hello friends. Today we're taking a look in video number 6 of our series through 1st and 2nd Peter at 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 18 through 25. Now when we last left Peter, he was talking about obligations that we have to civil authorities, civil government, and in this section he's going to talk about obligations that slaves have to their masters. Here's the text. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused or reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that, free from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Now the first thing I want to mention in this text is that the New Testament never ever sanctions slavery. Now what it will do is tell slaves and masters how they ought to conduct themselves in the social condition in which they lived. But I think we ought to make this clear from the outset that Peter is not condoning slavery in this text. He's not sanctioning slavery in this text. He's just saying here is how slaves ought to conduct themselves with masters. And in particular, he's saying in verse 18, you ought to submit yourselves to your masters, even those that are harsh with you and unkind with you. Now, it's interesting to me that this is unusual, first of all, because the household rules that were often in the first century never included instructions for slaves. There were always instructions for masters, and the reason was that they felt there was no moral duty that slaves had because they weren't considered persons. Only masters were told how to conduct themselves because they were real people, 100% people, who had moral duties to fulfill. Slaves were not considered real people. So it's interesting to me that Peter in this text actually lifts slaves to a level where they are people of worth and people of value. And he says, you have obligations too, even to those masters that are unkind to you. And he says in verse 18, you do this out of your reverence for God. Now he doesn't say for God, but I think that's what this text means. He says, do it with all deference. Well, to whom is this deference or respect or reverence shown? I think it makes greater sense to say that it's shown because of God. Out of your reverence for God, out of your respect for God, out of your deference for God, treat your masters this way. Voluntarily submit to them. And then in verses 19 and following, he tells them that he wants them to patiently endure unjust suffering. That's the message of this text. Not only should you submit to these masters, but your aim is to endure suffering that you may not even deserve. And why is that? Because in verse 21, your aim is to imitate Christ. To this you have been called, slaves. To what have we been called? You've been called to imitate Christ, because Christ also suffered for you and left you an example that you should walk in his steps. This kind of undeserved suffering and their response to it, response that is patient, it identifies them with Christ. Peter says this is exactly what happened to Jesus. He suffered when he didn't deserve it, and that's verse 22. He committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. In other words, there was no reason why he was due the suffering that he experienced. And it's the same in your case. You may have to suffer, undeservedly so. But after all, you're identifying with Christ here, and you have been called to follow in his steps. Now, I think this is an interesting word here, example. Christ left you an example. Did you know this is the only time in the New Testament that this word example is used? And it was used in the first century by Greek writers to refer to a child's exercise book, a pattern in a child's exercise book, which he was to imitate as nearly as possible. It was used as to refer to the pattern letters that a school child would carefully trace out to learn the letters of the alphabet. And what I appreciate here in this text is that Peter is saying to these slaves and to us that Christ is our pattern. Oh, I believe in a pattern in the New Testament, don't you? Jesus is our pattern for sure. We ought to conduct ourselves the way that Jesus conducted himself, and we are called to this kind of lifestyle. Follow in his steps. Imagine footprints on a beach. You're stepping into those same footprints on a beach. Jesus is our model. Jesus is our pattern. And how did Jesus respond to undeserved suffering? Verse 23, when he was reviled, that is, when he was railed against with terrible words, he didn't feel the need to revile in return. When he was abused, he didn't abuse in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten those who persecuted him. What did he do? He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He entrusted his cause. He trusted his cause to the judge. He let the judge handle it. He let the judge speak for himself. Boy, this is a word that we need to hear, isn't it? Because I think we're so prone to fight back, to strike back, to defend ourselves when people malign us or abuse us or persecute us. I'm thinking of a time recently when Becky and I went to Walmart and we're crossing the pedestrian walkway to go into the Walmart store, and there's a car that's trying to cross that pedestrian walkway, and he thought that he had beat us to the walkway. We didn't pay much attention to it. We thought we had the right of way, and he felt entitled. He revved his engine when we walked by, as if to say, I was here first, and then he rolled down his window and sent us a very unkind gesture, and then cursed us out. And I wish that I had been more like Jesus and had just walked into the store and not felt the need to strike back, but instead I responded and called him an idiot, if you must know. I'm not proud of that. I didn't respond as Jesus did. How often should we just respond by trusting ourselves to the judge who judges justly and not feeling the need to strike back? Now, there are times when we need to defend ourselves. Sure, Paul felt that way and Jesus felt that way on occasion, but when it came to unjust suffering, Jesus just trusted the judge to settle matters. He didn't feel the need to strike back or to retaliate in kind. But Peter tells us something else in this passage. He says, you slaves need to accept unjust suffering patiently because Christ did, and Christ left you an example. But he also says that he did it for you. Christ also suffered for you, verse 21. And then verse 24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross. And what Peter shows us here is that the death of Jesus was substitutionary. He substituted himself for us. We were the ones who deserved the suffering because of our sins, but he went to the cross and bore our sins on that tree. It was a substitutionary death. And why was it a substitutionary death? Why did Jesus take that position? What was the aim of it? Verse 24, so that, free from sins, we might live for righteousness. Jesus died for us so that we would not only escape judgment from death and judgment from guilt of our sins, but he died for us so that we might live free from sin and live in the service of God. Boy, I think that is really an interesting comment, and one that we probably need to undermine. What did Jesus want us to have? He wanted us to have a freedom from a life of sin and a freedom to live as God intends for his children to live. So Jesus died not only to save us from our sins, but he died so that we might feel the freedom to live as God intended us to live. No longer shackled by our sins, no longer shackled by our guilt of sin, but to live in a way that God intends for us to live. And then finally, in verse 25, Peter says, "You slaves are no longer sheep, but you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." And that must have been a great comfort to them to know that Jesus was with them, that he was their shepherd, that he was their protector, their guardian, their caregiver, their overseer, and he would not leave them, even in times when they would suffer unjustly. Boy, there's so much in this passage. Such a great passage, isn't it? Jesus is our model. Jesus is our example. We ought to follow in his steps. We ought not to feel like we need to strike back when we're maligned or persecuted. We ought to trust the one who judges justly. He will defend us. And what a great privilege it is to have someone like Jesus who leads us as our shepherd and who provides for all that we need. Beautiful passage. All right. Hope I didn't talk too long this time. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time. God bless.